Okay, I think we'll start. Welcome to Relational Matters Archive conversation number 3 with Domi Olivieri. It's a great pleasure to see you all again and to see you, Domi, here. My name is Katrin Thiele. I'm the initiator of the project, and otherwise I'm teaching and researching in the Grad Agenda program at Utrecht University. Here with us is also Ida Hillerup Hansen, a PhD researcher at Utrecht University and co-organizer of the Relational Matters Archive. Ida will oversee all the technical details in these sessions and also moderate the session's chat, which can be used by all live participants here. Ida, do you want to say a few words about these technical things?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm here as per usual to let you know that the Relational Matters Archive runs a series of conversations throughout the spring and summer of 2022, hopefully much longer. The conversations are recorded and they will be available on the webpage, where you can also go to learn more about the project. So each conversation is loosely structured around the same 3 questions. And it will last about 45 minutes, and then will be followed by a Q&A, which I will moderate, and we encourage all attendees to share your questions in the chat function, and then I will raise as many as time allows us. Yeah, we had a question before if it's intentional that you cannot be heard. The mic and video is switched off because of the format we operate with. Yeah, so now the floor to Domi and Katrin.
Yes. We want to really invite all of our participants, of course, online to share really questions in the chat. I would like to now say a few words about the conversations we are having here in this Relational Matters Archive and what the work that it hopes to do, and then also introduce to you today's conversation partner. The Relational Matter Archive aims to collect insights and divergent practices dealing with relationality as a starting point for research inquiries and ways of living. The archive is part of a project in which 2 claims are interwoven in the attempt to engage with and attune ourselves to today's planetary condition. On the one hand, an engagement with relational matters, which expresses an insistence on the intra-active and messily entangled condition of current times. And on the other hand, the statement that relation matters, meant as an ethico-political wager to become more literate and maybe more carefully attuned to what entanglement as living condition implies. That is, what does such a claim ask from us when living it? It's important for me to also emphasize that to take a relational point of departure does not propose relationality as a solution in itself. Rather, our conversations around relational matters want to inquire what relationality means in specific contexts and on different scales, and how a relational approach could offer significant insights to what is happening around us, amongst us, or within us. This much about introductory word about the archive itself. There's a project website, Relational Matters Archive.nl. You could always check that and see more. I would now like to turn to today's conversation and introduce to you also our special guest, my long-term colleague in the Grad Agenda program here at Utrecht University, Domi Olivieri. But before I say a few words about her, let me once more also start this Relational Matters session by pausing and taking notice that the war in the Ukraine, that last time when we met here has just started, is continuously and heavily ongoing. It's now the 5th week of war, and so many people are in need to flee, leaving behind their homes and daily lives, not knowing if they can ever come back, arriving at places they don't know. Last time I spoke about that it's once again a special week. Now I'm quite clear that after COVID-19, this war also definitely has already or will have changed our lives foundationally. But in a time like this, it seems to become ever more important to also find some moments of being present somewhere. And as I also said last time, I feel that I want to not give up all spaces and have also other conversation in the midst of war and pandemic. So, and this is maybe a consequence of the precarious times we are living in right now. In these first sessions of this archive, I turned quite explicitly to friends and scholars I worked with for a long time. Having a conversation, being fully present in a conversation, is right now still something quite special after all these years of pandemic. I hope that via these sessions, we develop such moments. Now about Domi, who will engage in today's conversation with me and with all of us. Domi Olivieri is an anthropologist, activist, teacher, and researcher who works as an assistant professor in the graduate gender program here at Utrecht University. Domi's research and didactics are in the field of feminist, queer, post-colonial, and decolonial theory, documentary film, visual anthropology, media, and cultural studies. Domi is active in academic, artistic, and other political spaces and has been always involved for many years in feminist, queer, anti-racist, anti-capitalist militant activism. Domi's scholarship is in documentary film or cinema studies, and some of her publications include on the diasporic proximities, spaces of home in European documentary, which she wrote for the journal Transnational Cinemas. She also was co-editing a special issue in feminist media studies that was entitled Affective Encounters, Tools of Interruption for Activist Media Practices. And another chapter I want to name is Shattering Images and Desiring Matter, a dialogue with Hito Steyerl in a book called Carnal Aesthetics, Transgressive Imagery in Feminist Politics that some of you maybe have seen in the last years. As we also seen from the text Domi offered us to read for this session, her latest work now focuses on documentary practices, time, and spaces of the everyday, forms of social and political relationality and contestation, activist interventions in neoliberal academia, and rhythm in documentary media. So much about Domi. Thanks so much for being here with us today. It's a great pleasure to have this conversation with you. We worked together for such a long time, but I'm still really curious to hear what you'll share with us on the questions that guide this Relational Matters archive.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and for the people who are here in presence, making the time, and maybe for people who will listen to us later on, also for making the time.
Wonderful. So let us start.
Yes.
The first question that starts our conversation is, how does relationality actually figure in your work? How would you say, are you engaged with relationality, or from which angle are you engaging with relational matters?
Yes. Thinking about this, this answer really forced me to think about all those aspects that I gave as sort of implicit in my work. I've never focused on relationality as a concept, although recently maybe I am, but I feel like I've hopped around this question of relation and relationality in so many ways. And so to try to organize all of these angles, I would say I come to this conversation from different angles, and I'll try to cluster them just to give also a sense of, I guess, where is my standpoint from, where this conversation come from. So on the one hand, I think my political activism has been more formative than I had realized in these questions of relationality. And I speak specifically of forms of collective practices, of feminist collective practices, queer forms of what some people could call commoning, and how that has really shaped my way of looking at everything that I do, even before I knew that there was a field of scholarship that dealt with relationality. Then, of course, there is anthropology, which is the field of study that I chose, and I arrived from there to feminist theory and gender studies, let's say. And so in that sense, this curiosity towards forms of relating across differences, before I even had the terms, this question of self and other, has been a way to entering in this conversation. And then maybe lastly, the engagement with art, in the sense that until talking about the political aspects or the collective political aspects and the anthropological, more scholarly aspects, I always focus very much on this question of relating among people or groups or spaces, let's say. But then I realized that both in my more, let's say, recent, not so much anymore, work with films and documentaries, but also early on with visual art and music, which is also one of my other backgrounds, there is also this relating to the artwork, or relating to the sounds, or relating to cinema. And I never saw these three aspects as actually being so interconnected as I do now in attempting to answer this question. So I would say that these are my entry points, more as ways of, without sounding too pretentious, but more as way of living and not only as forms of thinking. And the thinking that I have been exploring constantly has been helping me to put into words maybe what these forms of experiencing and living and relating meant, and why they meant so much, or why they meant in a specific way. And of course, all of this under the approach of feminist theory and, broadly speaking, gender studies, which has made all of this political in a way that I think is maybe exactly as you introduced this whole project, the ethical and political aspect of relationality across different forms, as I mentioned, but that is really where I'm entering in this. And I don't think I'm entering through a specific field of scholarship, although I have certain, let's say, legacies to certain inspiring thinkers. And Trimina being one of those who has been recurrently entering in my work without even realizing it, as well as indeed other forms of thinking that come maybe from less structurally scholarly spaces. That is, forms of thinking about how do we create, how do we make certain experiences, certain spaces, certain encounters to become political, or what is political in certain encounters. So some of those insights have also come, I guess, from just conversations, not only with texts, let's say, conversation with films, conversations with other people, conversations with traversing different geopolitical spaces. Yes, and maybe then all of this, because I guess this is also relevant to what we shared with the other, well, with each other and with the people who are here. I feel that the work I've been doing in the last year, that is this engagement with academia, is sort of not the final convergence of all of these things, but definitely a place where these things are coming together. And one of the questions that I am exploring, and I'm curious to see if it emerges or if it resonates with people, is also this thinking of relationality, both in different scales, let's say. So in the scale of the relation between subjectivities, or between collectives, or between groups, the relation with indeed artwork or films, and let's say, for the sake of now, we can call them at a more minute scale, an interactive scale, that is, let's say, at a certain level, and the relation to the institution. And this form of relationality with the institution, although we all experience it all the time with all forms of institutions, being the school, the police, the insurance companies, as well as, of course, universities, for those of us who are connected with it, that has been my latest challenge, to see how insights that I gathered coming from a certain level of relationality, I wouldn't necessarily want to say horizontal versus vertical, but a micro interaction, or interaction, as maybe you would say, Catherine, or a micro level. How does that relate, and what can it do to the institution? And this is, it's not at all resolved. It's a tension that I am working with. And it's also a tension that emerges from my specific standpoint, that, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of political activism that I come from was also a form of, let's say, autonomist movements from Italy, which made the decision of not engaging directly with institutions, but creating other forms of relationality, we would say. There were maybe eventually going to change the broader institution as the state, or the nation, or the capital, or whatever. But actually, it was a choice of working for counter spaces of relationality. And I feel that's very much informs a lot of the conversations that we have sometimes, maybe some of the stuff I write too. And then now I've arrived to this point, okay, and how do we then what are the frictions that happen when these forms of relating interact necessarily with the institution, with the capital I, let's say. This is where I'm entering in this whole knot.
Let me one more little question, or kind of one more little comment that you might want to respond to once more about this. So what I very much hear is that for you, the relational, even without first of all considering that you're working on such a concept or whatever, is always very much part of your understanding of the political and the collective. And then what I find very interesting that you now also say you also learned this in relation to, say, artworks or film. So somehow it's a political notion for you, if I understand you correctly, or do you have a political interest into the topic of relational matters? But it's not only about politics in the classical sense as we now imagine, even if also that comes into you, how you introduce it. You also speak very much about an aesthetic or a material approach to this. If you would like to say a little how maybe that inflects still that you are seeing how you're engaging in institutions, but also in the broader world politically, how that might matter. I think that is something very specific about your
yes
also.
Yes, indeed. I think so. Definitely, that form of relationality, and I think it has taken many different turns in my own understanding. I started working very much the question of the senses. That was, so let's say, an epistemological relation to cinema, for example, is a lot of the background I come from, but also broadly speaking about senses and sensoriality, also from anthropology. So that was also a way of relating that doesn't only go through, let's say, obviously, but I'm saying it anyways, through the sort of the analytical level of comprehension and understanding in that sense of the cognitive, if we want to say that way, but very much this sensoriality. And then from there, and I haven't abandoned that, I'm still working with this idea of senses and bodies in that sense. I think the publications you mentioned resonates with these terms as well, and the affective. And a form of affective, or trying to work with this idea of affects in forms that really start from encounters of bodies and senses, very much also I use affects in the sense to underline that there is not a prior subject positions or a prior item, agent that pre-exists that form of sensorial affective interaction. And I think that's how indeed I then work with films and documentaries specifically. And that's also why I'm interested a lot in very much in how films, for example, especially documentary, how they work, sometimes a lot more, and maybe, I don't think it's a problem, but sometimes I realize a lot more than what they are about. This question of the how, so in that sense, maybe fits into our second part, our second question. This form of thinking through the senses and affect has been my entry point into the how of relating.
Yes, wonderful. I think it's a brilliant move towards the second question that I will read to you in a second, or say to you in a second. But I think we also share that very much, that it resonates very well with me, that that the how is often also to me much more important than the what. But now, so if we go a little bit more into detail, also because this archive is meant to maybe also inspire practices, really, be it in teaching or other kinds of practices. So for later, for, really as a collecting of voices. So which methodological shifts do you see emerging from a relational approach in your research, but in as much in your activist practices? And really methodological, maybe you can say something more also, like in terms of, we know each other from, also the context in which we work, and as also a feminist practicing or pedagogy. So I think, there's a lot that I see resonating here.
Yes, absolutely. It's many shifts, or is a okay. One thing of focusing on this question of relations and the how also to me feels like it's never fully completed. There is a lot of shifts constantly happening. But if now somewhat fictionally, because in my mind they're so connected, but in methodologically when working with films and documentary especially, that is my field of choice, let's say, then focusing on the how is a choice in the sense of indeed of how certain strategies and cinematographic decisions and so forth, what they do, right? So not the how in and by itself, but in terms of what does it do? What does a film do? What does it provoke? And how is this provoking of specific reactions, emotions, affects by, let's say, the viewers or the people who experience the film? What can they do in terms of how does it translate into other forms of being or other forms of relating? So this to me is very much a way of looking at films in terms of what can they do, right? How can they provoke new ways of seeing, new ways of relating, new forms of subjectivity or collectivities or whatever. So definitely that's part of the methodology, I suppose. And on the other side, another side of it is I find is the open-endedness, not in a kind of course, not in a kind of relativism that never gets anywhere, but a form of open-endedness in the sense of keep asking questions and keep seeing how does, if we go from the films, for example, to other forms of relating, and pedagogy is for me being a very important one, then there is this sense of being affected by the other that you encounter, whether it's the film or if we move to the spaces of the classroom, the colleagues and the students. And so that is a different methodology, which I think is also something that I know resonates with you, Catherine, and some other of our colleagues, that is this practicing, in the sense, a methodology through relationality in pedagogical practices, which I think is a feminist way of being in a classroom and not just in the classroom, outside, around, before and after, that necessarily stay with me in the sense of constantly being affected by it, which I think I don't know if it's a methodology as such that we could call it, but it's a form of listening. And I know this again resonates with some of your work. I think listening to me is very connected with these forms of a methodology of relationality. And it doesn't come with, I mean, it comes with a lot of other potential problematics, but I think this is something that I find being part also of a way of understanding relationality that is actually, let's say, non-sovereign, in the sense of a non-sovereign relationality, and also a it's also about being a lived relationality again. So a form of being affected and staying open to this being affected. And I think that's also what I imagine being a way of being a feminist teacher, for example. And we spend a lot of time talking about this, because that is, I think, to me, has confronted me with a form of thinking about relationality and the politics of it, and the politics of knowledge production that emerge from this engagement, which has a lot to do with being in the space. I still tend to think in terms of the physical space, but let's say sometimes it does happen also in the virtual space. And how can we, so in that sense, the shift is an ongoing, because I'm still working, I think many of us are still working, you and I for sure, into what are the ways in which theorizing relationality and experiencing it and making it at the forefront of our political way of entering also into our job, what can they look like? So in that sense, it's less of a shift that I see the end of it, and more of a process that I am constantly thinking about.
But I think it's very important what you're saying. Maybe exactly the shift is to attend to the process, and I'm using now attending to very carefully or kind of very explicitly, because in your text, I thought it was very interesting and really so nicely put. I feel that you see this art of noticing that you take also from Tsing, or just like attending, the attentiveness, also as a strategy to resistance. And I would like to maybe keep this also still in this second question, or in this moment of the process, because what you're describing indeed has queer feminist pedagogical, that is, I think, what is also very much at the foundation of these, that somewhat it is an engagement within the institution or with the institution, say in the university or in other educational sectors. But it is also a way, I would say, to transform them, of course, or to kind of keep something alive when we speak about the neoliberal academy that you are writing about in this in your text. So maybe what I would like to ask you, how in what sense can you maybe say a little bit more still about the how this becoming more listening and attentive, and also dealing with the complexities of our being within the institution, but also trying to, you know, make it livable or keep it livable, how that is related to you to forms of resistance, because you emphasize very much a collective, the collective, and you said it also very at the beginning of this conversation, that it is always for you not an individual but a collective thing. And maybe you can bring these things still a little bit more together.
Yeah. I think this form of attention, and this, I mean, if anybody at any point wants to also, you know, from the listeners to tell me more, I landed to this question of attention because I think that is a methodology in a way, right? Because it also brings together the affective and the sensorial. The attention is, again, your whole body is attentive. It's a perceptive mechanism of being attentive. And I connected with slowing down because I feel that, and I theorize that through indeed these documentaries that I work with, that in order to really listen or to really be perceptive, or to be more perceptive than, let's say, usually we tend to be, this moment of slowing down is one such strategy. Not only because indeed it interrupts specific time management dynamics and speeds that we know of society and especially of the university, but and also because it allows I think a different form of relating. But the concept of attention is still something I'm working on. That's also why sometimes I also resort to poetry or to forms of understanding this, because I feel that it's a mode of being, but porously being, in a sense. That is the attention that I'm thinking about. And in relation to the university, it's that is where the shift is, because in some ways, a form of attending in itself, which is, I think, the experience that I had by watching certain films. It really started from there. And then I felt, because I always feel that, indeed, as you said, that there is something more to it. And so then this, what can it do? What is this mode of attention with these films, for example, allow me to experience? How can that also translate into other practice, especially in the academic space, because that's the one where also a lot of my politics now are happening, also just in terms of what I do. So I think in that sense, the collective aspect of it is something that, again, is a work in progress. I started this project completely alone. I mean, talking to friends and loved ones, and not thinking that it was going to go anywhere more than maybe an article. And then actually the article that was shared came from a call for paper for a panel for a conference of engaged anthropology. I think that was the panel. And so then I was forced to think about the engaged part. That is, there is something that also does something, right? This mode of attention then needs, in my mind, needs to become a mode of resistance, because to me, an engaged scholarship has to do with resisting, or not resisting for the sake of it, but, you know, in light of creating a more just world, or you know, being against whatever cis-hetero capitalist patriarchy and all of that. So in that sense, the project has become one of dialogues, actually. And trying to see, actually, I've noticed as soon as I started talking to people that I was working on this question of slowness as a form of resistance, it really resonated with a lot of people, but not necessarily in a sense that anybody knew, although I know scholars, and among others, somebody you also invited, like Vivian, have been working, and there's a lot of scholarship on slow academia, more than I thought when I started. And so for me, the challenge was, okay, what can I add to this? How can these insights, or this attention that comes also from the engagement with films or other forms of art, add a little different perspective to this, or additional perspective. So working on it, but something that I have been doing is to indeed trying to talk more about this. And now actually I'm working with an intern, let's say, who's here also, I think, listening to us. And we started not really knowing where we were going to go, but talking to people in the university, starting from our program in gender studies in Utrecht, but also beyond, both as students, as colleagues at different stages of their career, as researchers, and just trying to listen for now, and trying to listen when one says slowness is a strategy of resistance, or slowness, what is your relationship to slowness in your studying or in your doing research in your job, what comes to you? And so I think that in some ways is a relational approach to the very question. And it is challenging because it's difficult not to know where you're going sometimes, right, with research. But definitely, I think it's part, I'm trying humbly, but proudly, to put into practice this form of listening and attention in the process of doing this research, let's say.
Wonderful. I want to just say, yes, I feel very resonating that also with this archive here, we didn't know how this will develop. And I think that is really something that methodologically maybe is interesting about relational matters, as I would now say, that indeed one has to be quite open to where things are taken in each of these conversations, or also in your dialogues. What I like very much about what you're saying, and it comes once more back to your text, is I like very much that you are attentive to the films and to the documentaries, and the way you described this one documentary, I really could also resonate with experiences of film that I have, that indeed is more than just a personal experience. You think like you're slowed down, and thus it's kind of a technical thing, or it's just like an art thing or whatever, but it really does something to the perception. It widens, and actually you go out of this film differently than you came in. And I would like to emphasize, I think would agree that that is something that has the dimension of the collective in it, because I don't think it's a personal. I mean, of course, there's always, you can also not be affected by this specific film or visual or you know, a specific piece, but overall there is a collective dimension to it. And I like that you're bringing, this is maybe vague, it's like maybe not so concrete as a collective, but I think it is an attention to some dimension that that I very much understand, that you call it, that this is something more, what it does, and really does in a sense of it does something, and not only for you, but it does something. So thank you.
If I can just add, like, this form of the collective, I think is also why me, together with other people, we think of art, like the power of art, not in a normative way, but of really activating forms of feelings, forms of being, and that is collective in itself, in the sense of, you know, the way that we are affected by art. It's something that we relate with each other about. Yeah.
So since time is of the matter also, I would like to hear also from you, where do you see tensions or dangers, or also limitations, to really think from a relational starting point? I mean, now this is of course something that we find here in this archive very much, but where do you see, you know, that there are maybe potential limitations, and definitely limitations, but potential dangers for it?
Yeah, well, I mean, a limitation, or at least a complication of it, is also in the very research that we were talking about, because there is this sense of, okay, I try to be very self-reflexive or critical even about that, in the sense of this idea of slowing down in and by itself can create questions such as who can slow down? What are the conditions of possibility, political, social, economic condition of possibility? So if we connect this form of attention and attending to the world and relating to the world, then a question comes from let's say, a political perspective, in that sense of who can do that. And so then it makes us ask what are we missing, or who are we missing in this thinking about relationality? However, I still think that there are ways of talking about relationality that doesn't have to be exclusionary along lines of access, financial means or status, but it's definitely risky because it needs to be spelled out. And I think so a risk of relationality, let's say, as a term that sometimes is used, is an assumption of some form of horizontality of sameness, that we're all related, we as people, and in relation to our environment, to each other, or our non-human animal others, as if we're all on the same, level. And so in that sense, I think relationality is, the way I understanding, is not at all about that, because it is about relating and taking into account the difference that enables specific form of relating. But I say the risk is there to see it as a kind of, flattening of differences. Something that I see sometimes also, or I encountered, that it can be seen as an answer instead of as a methodology in some ways, so that then relationality or relation per se become almost the solution to all possible questions. And often is, I think it's been discussed before, but it becomes also a way to then see relations per se as quote unquote positive, or loving, joyous, caring. Although when I think of relationality as a mode of being in the world, or as a starting point, I do see in terms of care and vulnerability and joy and justice. But I think it's important to acknowledge that relating and relationality as a framework needs to take into account all the frictions and all the tensions, which I think is also comes back to the risks in more, like, let's say, micro scale, which is, for example, in the classroom or in our job, right? So being so, or let's say, listening and open and attentive creates actual very specific risks of not being able to, for example, complete specific works, or to not have time, or to not have the energy or the space to do a certain work that is demanded of us, for example, by academia, and sometimes also this is maybe more personal, but it's a risk in the sense that conversations, which is really what inspires me, conversations with other people, as well as with artwork and film and all of that, sometimes they tend to remain very much on the level of the ephemeral or the oral. And then to go from that to a form of, for example, writing them, because there is a form of fixing in writing, of course. But on the other hand, if we don't do that, then that intervention that we could do through relationality can remain, let's say, ephemeral. And we can say a lot of things about this word. So I do think that these are some of the potential risks, although I enjoy being in these risks because I can, because also I'm in a position, like academically and personally, that allows me to stay with these risks. But definitely I see some of these potential pitfalls there.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, I agree. I very much see that too. And I like very much that you point out that what also for me is in what I said also in the beginning about this space, it is, the tendency to answer everything with relationality is definitely something one has to be very much aware. And also in this openness of maybe research or openness of practice, that it is not done with that it is relational, but that it has to exactly also remain very much aware or listening to the frictions and to the difficulties, and actually to a relation of complicity, or to the relation of being implicated, and having to also be aware about these dimensions of relationality is extremely important. Nonetheless, I find it also very nice how you bring it back to pedagogical practice, because if we want, I mean, I know your way of teaching as well, and I mean, if we want to maybe and live in a more interactive and turned around classrooms and all that, then it is really important that there is also the practicing of a more open-ended way, and to find that line to not be too open-ended, so that it can look like as if it's either what you call ephemeral, or maybe relativistic, or maybe just open by itself, but still make an intervention. I think that is really a very thin.
Yeah, if I can just say, one last thing about it. You use these two words, I wrote them down, is this feeling implicated and resistance. I think these two things, to me, they're always together, and that's what creates the friction, which when it comes out in a conversation or otherwise, is full of potential ideas. But I think the resistance and the feeling implicated is very much the very position of even theorizing relationality, or putting it, or speaking it politically. I mean, there is so many directions in which you can go, but staying with the university space and our forms of research, this feeling implicated because, well, we need to sometimes reproduce the same forms of injustice or time pressure or finite answers as we are trying to resist them. And how to stay there, that is the challenge. To stay having, let's say, the will and the, I think, collective energy and support to resist them while staying in them, which makes you feel implicated in a way that sometimes you would just want to not feel implicated and take a different route and go exactly outside of the institution, whatever that means. Yeah.
Thank you, Domi. I think our time is up for now. I would love to now invite Ida in again, and we come to our last part of questions and answers here amongst us. Please, dear audience, fill in some questions in the chat if you want to have further explications on something or commenting or further conversations.
Yes, there's already 2 questions actually.
Will you read them to us?
Yes, of course. So Anna is asking, I would like to hear Domi talk more about the risk of ephemerality, please.
Yes, I know people who have actually engaged with this question of the ephemeral, especially with material culture. And I think that there is so much more to it. But the way that I brought it in now, I think I connect in this case ephemerality as something that doesn't remain archived, or is this very difficult to archive, but also as something that from a scholarship perspective, it doesn't translate into a concluded project, which in our world is often an article. Even conferences can be ephemeral, although we very much know that they are embodied and material in so many ways. And I think the risk is also what sometimes I see as a drive. That is, I think with this orality and ephemerality, let's say, there is a way to actually staying with the collective and avoiding the authorship to it. So not to say that ephemeral material have not been produced by people who we know as author, but there is a collective impetus. If we think, for example, of pamphlets of collectives and other forms of material culture that emerges from groups, or if we think of indeed sometimes conversations, I find that the potentiality of ephemerality being connected with the collectivity are huge. And so then the risk is that, but maybe it's a welcome risk, is a diminishing of the individualist or the individual or the individualism that can be beyond that materialization, if that makes sense. So it's a risk in specific lines of work, or it maybe it's a risk of the self. Maybe it's a self that doesn't find its own production very clearly materially staying in time, but I do see as a potential welcome risk, but a very vulnerable risk to take, I find, and we can go in specific directions. But yeah, that's maybe the first thing that comes to mind.
Thanks.
Sorry?
Ida, yeah, there's
another question from Eva. So could you talk practically about a methodology of slowness, or more specifically, what would be a slow question?
Yeah. In a way, part of this step of the research that we are doing is exactly to think about, let's say, a methodology of slowness, not so much about a question, but I call them strategies in the sense of, or even tactics, maybe. Tactics of slowness, and they become very minute. I did list maybe some of them, just the ones that I could think about in the article. So I'm not sure that that I have an answer as a methodology, but a slow question, that's actually an interesting question, what a slow question is. I feel that I've been focusing very much on strategies and tactics of slowness to resist, counteract, or present an alternative to the speeds of, let's say, neoliberal university. In that sense, I think this question of how to ask a slow question is something I would have to think about more, but something that I can say preliminarily is, again, it's a question that is built as you're talking. I don't know, it sounds maybe simplistic, but it's being open to receiving a partial answer to your partial question that redesigns your original question. So maybe the slowness in that sense is a sense of mutuality, maybe, that grows in that sense. So a question that is not completed. On the other hand, of course, an incomplete question doesn't have to be, or an ambiguous question doesn't have to be necessarily slow, but the slowness maybe here is in this form that I was describing earlier as a form of attending, also not only linguistically or in spoken terms, if that makes sense. So maybe a slow question, but now I'm sort of thinking more, the anthropologist in me, a slow question can also be a form of inquiring with, say, something or somebody else, not only by listening to what they have to say, but also to seeing how they're answering, or even to see the space in which they're answering that question, or how their body is engaged in that question and answer.
Yeah, I like very much what you're saying. I would just what I would think about is also slowness. Kind of what you're describing is leading maybe to exactly a different question. So I think, you know, the question is actually in a methodology of slowness, something that might be not at the start, but actually is something that we want to come to, a different question. I would very much at least think it in that way also, that, you know, slowness as a process, as kind of this, what you're describing now, will lead to a different question, because to assume that the question is right there is, I feel, very much also already under the idea about that we know already what the question is. Whereas I think with slowness, and that might be related to forms of resistance with a different understanding of time or temporality, and living that otherwise, different questions could emerge, so that, you know, they could also be more disruptive, or potentially disruptive at least. I think we have only time for one more question.
Yes, there's one here in the chat, but I actually also have a question that maybe relates to.
Collect them also. Maybe you can also collect them.
Yeah. So here I will just post the one from Lieke. I really enjoyed hearing your talk about how slowness emerged for you from your experience of film art. I'm wondering if in your work that embodied an aesthetic experience of slowness translates to other political seeds and strategies, or if aesthetic experiences themselves are also part of those strategies. Thanks, Domi.
Ida, if you want to add yours, maybe then I can try to.
Yeah, also mine is a longer, it's a comment that your article actually is something that it made me think about, and then connecting perhaps back to sort of methodology of slowness, and more in terms of strategies of resistance in the university specifically. But so the comment first, I mean, I really enjoyed how your article delineated these effects of neoliberal university. And one of them really being the shutdown of programs that don't live up to measures of financial viability. And it made me think of this Danish newspaper article I read recently, where professors in the Slavic Studies department in Københavns University in Denmark were detailing how with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they were swamped by media and other news agents wanting them to comment on this. And these scholars, they principally refused to comment on something that was outside of their expertise. And so instead of kind of opting for exposure in this moment, they were pointing to another problem, this reduction of their department to 2 professors really and a handful of researchers, exactly because of this lack of institutional investment, right, along the lines of market value calculation. And so in that, they also connected this neoliberal trend of the university, which you in your article also say it's not just neoliberal, it's also colonial, right, to a larger geopolitical scale defined by Russian and US NATO empire building. And so also in that, pointing to the homogenizing and reductive assumptions that Russian and Eastern Europe in that way could fall under the same rubric, and they could all comment on it. So I really like to read this sort of refusal as a comment or as a moment of collectivity, right, of solidarity in wanting to, in the face of these neoliberal effects. And it made me think of also, again, what Katrin brought up, this, you stress collectivity as so significant for this strategy, embodied and effective strategy of slowness. And so I was actually also just interested in hearing you talk more about what that means in terms of also mobilizing a lot of different people and a lot of different interests, perhaps, into a somewhat of a united front. Like, what's the necessity there, of course, but also the difficulty.
Yes, thank you both. On some things, these two questions are actually related in my mind, so that's great. To your last point, Ida, of course, that's kind of what I'm striving towards, your last point. You know, what are these forms or these knots that can bring different kind of people and collectivities together to sort of have a strategy or a vision that somehow brings forward this different mode of engagement, in this case with indeed forms of hegemonic knowledges or forms of producing knowledge, and those forms are hegemonic in the sense of indeed colonial as well as capitalist and neoliberal and all of that. But I'm thank you, Ida, for stressing this question of refusal, because I do think, and I think actually other colleagues are surely more knowledgeable to that tactics, specifically when it comes to question of coloniality. I brought it up, and I think the situation that you described speaks very much to that. I think to refuse to respond to certain interpellations that actually by responding you are reproducing certain hegemonic ideas or certain homogenizing notions of who is an expert on what, and even the refusal of actually speaking. So these forms of withdrawing in a way from a question of visibility, right? Because that will be sometimes to refuse also means to not become visible or to not become one of those who has something to say about something. And I think in some ways this question of refusal, that's what connected with Lika's question, which actually I also really love your question, and you're saying towards something that I think I was actually hopping around, this idea of that embodied an aesthetic experience also in political scenes. That is exactly what I'm thinking about, and I think the question of refusal in a certain sense has to do with it, because actually, yes, I think that's why maybe I spent so much time in that first answer to say something about this political collectivity, and I do feel that forms of embodied ethical, political mode of being with others that I've experienced actually in political spaces, in political scenes, in specific collective spaces, whether it's outside of the university or in specific moments, you know, also transient moments with specific groups of people. When I was doing a radio program and sometimes organizing a demonstration, sometimes trying to put together an event or something like that. In those moments, I have experienced indeed forms of relating that are political and aesthetic that I think to me resonates with those forms that I also experience with film or with art. So you're going to, and I think the refusal has to do with that in the sense of it's a space that becomes something, or there is a specific interaction in that space that also exists because it refuses to engage with certain form of, let's say, normative, neoliberal or colonialist modes of engagement. This was my attempt at putting it all together. You're muted again, Katrin.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Domi. It was a long sentence at the end, but it was a wonderful ending point. It is time to close the session. Thanks so much for a wonderful session. Most of all, Domi, to you, of course, but also to all our attendees.